Would you please tell us, I have it, but tell us your title. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, Madam Chairman. My name is Stephen Dixon. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. My title is I'm the Florida State President of Florida A&M University National Alumni Association. I'm here in representing our national president, Dr. Alvin Bryan, who couldn't be with us today. First of all, let me say this, Madam Chairman. During the lunch period, I sort of developed the hiccups. So I hope, I don't know if I got another instant growth spurt here or not, but if it reoccurs, I apologize.
You're among friends. We understand everything.
My job here today, Madam Chairman, is to introduce to you our Government Affairs Chairperson, Mr. Charles Wright. And let me say this earlier, Madam Chairman, you mentioned that this board had not yet discussed the results or the findings of this report, which I think is very good considering some of the great comments that we've had thus far. And hopefully when Mr. Wright comes forward, he will be able to enhance some of those comments and findings and hopefully will help this board when it considers the report as given. So at this time, I would like to bring forth Mr. Charles Wright, which again is our Government Affairs Chairperson, and bring to you some of our concerns of the Pappas report.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry you had to wait all morning, but thank you for waiting.
Thank you for having us.
Certainly.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Wright.
Governor Roberts, Chancellor Rosenberg, members of the Board of Governors, and in particular, I would be remiss if I didn't pay homage and honor to one of the persons that I've always recognized as being a leader in education in the state of Florida, Dr. Stan Marshall. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be in the same space with you. Today, we want to give some feedback or give a response to the Pappas report. First of all, we are very pleased that the report was written. We are very pleased that Dr. Pappas has seen fit to elevate the report to the 90,000-foot level so that we could get a broad perspective on education in the state of Florida. We do think the report reached several very salient conclusions. However, there are some things that we must talk about as they relate to Florida A&M University and its role and its mission, historically, currently, and what it will be in the future. The one thing that was very telling in the report, it pointed out that the slate for the university system in Florida has been very unclean. Now, all of us understand that an unclean slate means that there has not been a good, comprehensive, compelling argument for how that mission ought to unfold. And that is a question that we felt must be addressed before any radical changes be made in how education is dispensed in the state of Florida. It's critical to us because the other thing that was mentioned in the report is the fact that Florida has suffered from mission leap, not just mission creep. We all know that we creep on missions, but when we begin to leap, it causes us some real concerns. As we addressed this report, we looked at those two issues, unclean slate, mission leap. And we had to come to several conclusions. And I would just like to call your attention to page 4 in the information that was passed out to you. I'm not going to read everything here because it's there for you to read, but I do want to read one passage, and it somewhat captures where we are today. Starting at the fourth line, we state, as insightful as the Pappas report might be in several sections, when the report addresses specializations of tasks which result in Florida A&M being identified as one of the institutions to focus primarily on the production of undergraduate degrees, we strongly believe the Pappas report almost totally ignores the realities of current public education, especially as it relates to minorities, in particular African Americans. For this reason, the FAMU Alumni Association submit this response, and we want you to pay particular attention to the 5 responses that we have there. And I'm just going to go on and read one of them. Number 1, Florida A&M University, like all other historically black colleges and universities, historically has been an all-purpose, full-service university to African Americans in particular, and to the United States as a whole. It's critical that we recognize that when FAMU was started in 1887, it was started as a response to a particular need that was not and could not be addressed by the current educational institutions that educated beyond high school. Whatever our historical perspective and view of that system, it really doesn't matter. What does matter is FAMU was designed to educate, in 1887, black students. In 2007, it still educates predominantly black students. It's critical that we look at some of the things that is happening in 2007. In 2007, the Pappas report pointed out that there are several high-demand areas that must be met. Areas like teaching, nursing, allied health, STEM programs, etc. FAMU has developed, both at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, responses to those high demand those high demand needs of the state of Florida. And it has even gone further and developed quality programs in pharmacy, business, and other areas. High demand. This morning we heard several of the speakers speak about the fact that education as it is now designed and used is no longer just an esoteric thing, but it's a prime generator in our competition with other states to get industry here. In order to get industry here, we must be prepared to supply employees. FAMU does an incredibly good job of supplying employees for that industry that demands a great number of people, especially at the graduate level. I will talk more about that in I shouldn't say a couple of minutes because my time might be out. So I'm just going to say in a few seconds. One other thing that was said this morning, and I think it's very important, and the Pappas report deals with it, that is that soft skills are going to be needed. Those skills such as communication, team building, and all of that. Let us not forget, FAMU, through his SBI program, was an early innovator in the perfection of soft skills and continue to be one of its purveyors, prime purveyors. One other thing the Pappas report stated, and I think it's extremely important when we look at education in general, it talks about pipeline and access points. Now, generally we would consider that pipelines and access points are being taken care of. But if you would follow me on page 7, the Pappas report point out that the state university system only admitted 537 students with SAT scores between 800 and 899. And clearly half of them attended FAMU. So the issue of minority, the issue of fulfilling a need for those coming out of the K through 12 pipeline, and frankly, indeed, out of the community college pipeline is being met at FAMU. The other thing that we wanted to point out is just looking this past year at graduate level students. We find that FAMU did some extraordinary things. This is on page 8. We point out that the Board of Governors statistics demonstrate that FAMU graduated 220 of the 1,013 black students receiving masters in the state university system. That exceeded both FSU, that graduated 204, and the University of Florida, that graduated 121. It also shows in the Pappas report that, with BOG statistics, that FAMU conferred 129 of the 230 professional degrees that was handed out to black students throughout the state of Florida, including all universities. We should also point out that those same statistics show that FAMU graduated 20, I state here 13, but there were 7 additional people that came out in the spring graduation, 20 of the 100 doctoral conferences in the state of Florida last year. I'm saying all of this to point out that while FAMU is a small school compared to the large University of Florida, University of South Florida, this institution here, FSU, its enormity in impact as it relates to black students is incredible. It's just incredible. And again, we say that while the report, the Pappas report, is good, as a matter of fact, we think it's very good because it forces us to begin to talk about the mission of FAMU, what it is, what it has been, and what it will continue to be, in relationship to the other universities, particularly as it carry out its mandated task of 1887 and its de facto task of 2007, which is to primarily educate black students inside the state of Florida. There are several charts in here that I won't go into. You can see those charts, and they pretty much speak for themselves. But the one thing that we should point out, that of all of the schools in the state of Florida that are graduating black students at the graduate level, FAMU has been the only one that has consistently grown in terms of its role in graduating black students. FSU has in fact declined. University of South Florida has in fact declined, and the graduating students at University of Florida has been erratic. We're talking now about doctoral students. So while we sit here today, we're asking that you consider the seriousness of what the Pappas reports say. And Dr. Pappas, we truly appreciate your scholarly work on this, because it is profound what you have done. But in that profound work that you've done, you have forced us to give legitimate discussion to the issue of disparity and what we have an opportunity to do starting today to overcome that and assure that all of the citizens of the state of Florida get an opportunity to participate in what is going to be the economy and the state of the future. I thank you. If you have any questions of us, I would be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Governor Edwards.
Mr. Wright, I thought that was an excellent, well-prepared response. My question's a tough one, I think. Looking 30 years from now, should Florida A&M 30 years from now still be what I will call, for lack of a better name, a historical black university?
The nomenclature can't change. It will always be a historically black university. If we're talking about what mission and what role it will be playing 30 years from now, I'm hopeful that the dialogue that will begin now will eliminate the need for us to have a difference in how our people in the state of Florida are educated and participate within the system. But until that happens, FAMU has a unique role to play, and I would say that we all have to commit ourselves to making sure that role is carried out.
Thank you. Questions? Comments? Thank you for this thoughtful response. Do you have further comments, please? Did you have a question? Did anybody?
Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks for the question, Governor.
Thank you. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Chancellor, comments?
Are there any other individuals who have arrived here with the intent to share their views on the Pappas report prior to a discussion in the form of a workshop that we will have from Nate Johnson on demographics? Hearing no other request, we are scheduled to hold this hearing until 3 o'clock this afternoon. There may be others who arrive with the expectation that they will be able to share their views. Madam Chair, we will now turn to a discussion, a presentation by Nate Johnson of our office on demographics, because as you've heard a number of speakers refer to the questionable numbers and the challenges that we have in anticipating where our system is going, and indeed that's a point that was made in the Pappas report as a point of departure. So we thought it would be useful for the board to get a sense of what the population distribution is likely to look like in the next few years, and perhaps we could have a discussion around that in anticipation of any possible further questions or presentations, and then we will close promptly at 3 o'clock. Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you, Johnson. We're ready. Do we have this in printed Any?
We do
No.
not. I am sorry for not providing handouts. However, I will send this to all of the board members, and we will post it on the website for others who are interested.
That'd be perfect. Thank you.
I'm hoping that this can be something of a dialogue with the board members. On our board, we have a real estate agent, at least one, and an employee of a major utility company. And of course, home sales and utility hookups are two of the big leading indicators for demographic trends in the state. We also have a broad geographic representation on the board, which can help balance the perspective or lack thereof you have sometimes trying to estimate what's going on in the state from Tallahassee. As several speakers have pointed out, the future in terms of population growth is not at all clear in Florida, especially at this moment. We've engaged in some conversations with the Century Commission, which is also trying to grapple with the issue of long-term population growth and is finding similar difficulties in looking ahead in the very long term. We can, however, look back in the past, and in case Dr. Pappas didn't think that 20 years was a long enough time horizon, I thought we might look back to the beginning of what might be considered the state university system back in 1905, when we had 620 students at the 3 institutions in the system. In the last century, between 1905 and 2005, the system grew at an average rate of 6% a year to just under 300,000 students. And I took the liberty of calculating what a continued growth rate of 6% a year would look like over the next century. And if that growth rate continues by 2021-05, we will have 133 million students in the state university system. There are risks looking ahead and making predictions, but I'm going to venture one at this point that we will not hit that enrollment level in 21-05. So what do we know at this point? The current data are not clear, but we do know a few things. The projections that the legislature is using from the economic and demographic estimating conferences are for continued relatively high population growth. I attended the demographic estimating conference just last week, and the demographers in the governor's office and the legislature are still looking at some signals that growth, at least in the aggregate, is maintained, and they were not at this point willing to significantly revise downward their overall demographic predictions. The more thoroughgoing look at the overall demographics for the state will not take place until the fall, but for now there were no major changes to the relatively rapid growth rate projections that we've had. The data also suggest that the SUS age groups are going to be growing faster than K-12, but slower than the overall population growth. And this is really the effect of the baby boomer generation retiring. A lot of them moved to Florida. That's going to be the biggest demographic sector that's growing in the state. The other factor, other than just the sheer level of population in the state that determines the amount of enrollment in our system, is the participation rate. And if we look at the last 15 years or so, we saw a rapid rise in participation rates, defined as the number of students in the key 18 to 24 age group as a ratio to the state population. The Hispanic student participation rate grew very rapidly, and black participation rates grew very rapidly in the early 1990s, but have been declining some in the last few years. The data are also suggesting at this point that the geographic distribution of growth may be changing from what we've seen in the past. From the significant growth levels in southeast Florida, we may be seeing more than we anticipated in southwest Florida, central Florida, and possibly in northeast Florida. One of the variables that's missing from all this is the policy choices. And that is that we are not simply responding as K-12 schools do to a forecast for a certain level of growth. We are also in the position of creating the capacity to accommodate whatever growth might be there, in generating demand or affecting demand by the decisions and policies we put in place to prepare students and the pricing decisions we make in terms of tuition, financial aid that determine how many of the students who could go to the university actually are able to come. And the last, even more ambiguous factor is that I'll leave as an open question, is what effect do the decisions that this board and other higher education leaders in the state make have on the overall economic and demographic growth of the state? If we have a strong, growing university system, is that something that in itself can be an engine of growth for Florida? The key age groups for the university system, about 70% of our total population is under the age of 25, and just under 90% is under the age of 35. It corresponds pretty well with the graduate and undergraduate age groups. There's a lot of variation, of course, from you see New College there with an extremely high proportion of its students in the traditional group. It has, of course, no graduate programs, down to Florida Atlantic University, which has probably the highest proportion of what we would describe as more non-traditional students in its student body. So these, of course, are the age groups that we want to look at when we're looking at the growth projections that we have for the state. Yes, Governor Duncan.
Yes, sir.
On FIU, what is the program that are causing, like at FAU and FIU, the larger young people? Are they doing some special program there, or is it just the
You're looking at that. That looks like maybe a couple % of the population. I don't know what they're doing that might be special there. I don't know if the former provost of Florida International has any insight.
I just think by comparison to some of the others that
There are no special programs to attract those younger students. They're just because perhaps of the demographics and the cultural mix, probably kids staying at home accelerated, and they're staying at home and going to school.
Right. It could be people graduating from high school at 17, or small. It's still a relatively small number, but that's a good question. I'll see if I can find something out. Yes, Commissioner.
Wouldn't that include the population that's taking accelerated courses in high school? They're taking our dual enrollment. They probably are included in that.
Yes,
population.
I would think so.
You say that would be no more.
Well, the question is, would there be more dual enrollment at FIU proportionally than there might be at UCF or at FAU, and I'm not sure that there would be. So we'll look into that. Unless you happen, do you know that as a fact?
No, I don't know that as a fact, but that would be the group, that are 17 and younger are those that are dually enrolled.
Yes. We'll check into that.
Over the last decade, of course, we had faster population growth from 1995 to 2005 in the 18 to 24-year-old group than in the state population as a whole. That was the baby boom echo coming to college, in a sense. And that growth is flattening out or becoming more even with the state as a whole. If you look at the blue and the black lines here, they grow at about the same rate over the next several years before it trails the state's overall population growth, which is the black line in the middle. And what you get instead is really those same students in this 25 to 29 accelerated growth rate moving forward from 2005, which is really the prime age group for graduate programs in the state university system. So it's the same phenomenon that we saw in the public schools a decade ago and up until the last few years, coming into the university system with the very rapid growth we've had in our undergraduate population, and we would anticipate a significant, and are seeing, demand for our graduate programs. which I think is probably good news for the two medical schools in the works.
Nate, may I ask a question, Madam Chair? Does it necessarily follow that just because there's that bubble in terms of the 25 to 29, that is graduate, that those students are they're obviously all eligible for graduate students, but I presume that many of them may not have a baccalaureate degree. So I'm just curious about being able to make that generalization that you just made.
Right. It is a prerequisite, of course, that they have a bachelor degree. It doesn't necessarily have to come from the state university system. If you look at the participation rates in the university system for the 25 to 44 age group, it's actually quite constant over the last 15 to 20 years, with some sensitivity to economic changes. I have a slide about that. But it is certainly true that if there are not a sufficient pipeline, if there's not a sufficient pipeline of students coming out with bachelor degrees, there may be a slackening in demand for graduate programs. And you'll note that whether or not these lines are above or below the overall trend line for the state, they're all growing significantly over the next 25 years.
So, Nate, one question before I leave that one. How much of the demand at the graduate level and advanced degrees, or at least professional degrees, are you factoring in the need that the jobs may demand more higher degrees, or is this just a normal average of students that make it through the progression?
This is really looking at the available pool. So broadly, the population out there that is in the age groups that we typically see in the university system.
So if we saw a big shift economically, that could change those numbers.
It could, and I do have a slide that I'll show you looking at graduate enrollment as it relates to the state's unemployment rate. I think Chancellor Armstrong could probably show you a similar slide for community colleges. The community college population and our graduate and professional population actually behave fairly similarly, in that demand tends to go up when there's a recession or unemployment goes up and people return to work to retrain. And of course, the timing for that is always terrible economically, because that's just when the state doesn't have the resources to meet the needs sometimes. As far as traditional students go, our entering class of first-time in college students, this compares the applications we get, which is a measure of demand, with some of the other indicators of academic and demographic trends in Florida. And the freshman applications is the red line, and you'll see over the last 15, 16 years, it has tracked most closely not with this gold line here, which is high school graduates, or with the number of 18-year-olds. It's actually tracked quite closely with the number of students taking the SAT exam in Florida, which has gone up considerably faster than the number of high school graduates or the number of 18-year-olds in the state, which is one reason that we have had a growth in participation rates. And then the top line, starting back in 1997 or so, is the growth in Bright Futures and the current projections for ongoing growth in Bright Futures from the legislature's Office of Economic and Demographic Research. They're projecting continued growth in Bright Futures participation at a rate above the growth in high school graduates. So this puts together the participation rates relative to the population with the estimates of the state's population growth. And there are a couple of different scenarios played out here. One of them is, if you look at our participation rate back in 1990, we had about 10.3 undergraduates for every 100 18 to 24-year-old students. And that rose and flattened out at about 13.7, 13.8 in the last few years. If that continues, given the current population projections, we would expect by 2012 an additional 28,000 students just from population growth, with no increase in participation rates. So that's labeled here the status quo scenario. On the other hand, where we've been talking about 50,000 additional students, and in fact we just had about 5,000 of those show up this fall from when we started having that conversation and using those numbers to where we are this fall. Where would those others come from? And one scenario is if you look at an increase in the rate of participation in the system comparable to what we had in 1990 to 2002, then you would end up with something around that 50,000 number. And projected even further out to 2030, if we got to 17.5 and the current population projections are on target, we would expect to have 470,000 students in the university system. So that's a high-end scenario. And I would point out that this number here, 17.5, is considerably higher than where we are now. But nationally, for enrollment in public four-year systems, the average in the U.S. is 18.5. So it is not unrealistic in terms of where we could go as a state if, in fact, those population projections are realistic and the participation rate is something that we can achieve.
So Nate, just if I could summarize, and what you're saying is if we could get up to the national average in participation, we would have a very significant ramping up of the number of students who potentially could be in the state university system.
That's right. That's right.
And really one of the jobs of this board should be to get to the national average in terms of participation.
That's right, and I would also point out that we have done it in the past too. If you look at this, trend line in the 1990s, so it is not something that cannot be done. If you had projected our enrollment in 1990 based on that participation rate, you would have been off by tens and tens of thousands of students.
Dr. Pappas.
I apologize if you mentioned this in your introduction, but when you have your enrollment projection status quo and then your participation increase, I think that's the participation increase is responding to the question that the chancellor just asked. But in terms of the enrollment projection, is inherent in that number a projection for population growth?
Yes. These are based on the population projections that are currently the state's official projections that were just reviewed last week that the legislature is using at this point.
Okay, and where is that base data? Whose data is that?
They contract with the Bureau of Economic and Business Research at the University of Florida, Beaver data. I do raise some questions about that in some further slides, and I'm looking for any input that you all might have, alternative sources of data or information, but there are conflicting signals at this point.
I would suggest to the board that in my line of work, we do an enormous amount of analysis based on population projections, and I think there are some inherent, very significant issues with Beaver's data. If you engage outside demographers, they will have all kinds of other avenues and ways of analyzing the population projection issue, which are very informative. And in many cases, Beaver's data is solid based on certain assumptions, but it uses a very interesting averaging process across the state. And I would suggest that for the purpose that we're engaging here, it is worthy of assessing Beaver's data in very fine detail, because the kind of anomalies we're seeing in K through 12 enrollment, which are dramatic, something is going on that that needs to be factored in, and that's on top of the inherent issues with the way Bieber's calculations are done. And so I just think that it's so fundamental to this effort that it needs a very careful look.
And I agree with you. I mean, that is fundamental, because if we're doing planning and expect to be taken seriously in our planning, it's important that we get it right. Now, is there some way you can take Governor Pappas's recommendation and include that in your?
I can. I'd like to go a step further, if I may. I agree with everything you said, and I have some of the same questions. We use them because they are the numbers that our funding source uses. So there's an advantage there. On the other hand, the averaging process they use assumes that the past is the future. They essentially project out with various types of math the future of the state, and you can see the bizarre conclusions that leads to from the exercise I did with the first slide, where if you project our university enrollment out based on the last 100 years to the next 100 years, you end up with 133 million people. So the carrying capacity of the state is something that I don't believe Bieber addresses or doesn't do adequately. And we've been invited by the Century Commission as well to work with them on these issues, because that's very key to their work as well. And they have similar questions about the numbers. And I would like to maybe some information from you about some people we might be able to consult with on this. If you have some ideas, I would very much appreciate.
I'll be happy to talk to you. We've used a number of different sources just to understand them, and I'll be happy to share those with you.
That would be great.
Thank you.
In the spirit of that conversation we just had, another way to look at these numbers, if the population projections are significantly off, you might bend those curves down, and if we have increase in participation rates but slower than expected or no population growth in these age groups, then we might end up with a line more like the lower one, not because of population growth but because of increased participation. So declining population or lower rate of population growth or even flat population does not necessarily mean declining enrollment in the state university system. That again is a policy decision and a policy issue. One thing that Dr. Porch and Dr. Pappas raised in their report was looking at the demographics of the state into the future and raising some concerns about enrollment and access given the changing racial and ethnic composition and the historically lower rates of participation in higher education of the Black and Hispanic students. So this looks at the current projections for what the state would look like in 2030. We would be going from about 16.5% Black population to 18.1% over the next 20 years. And for Hispanic, we'd be going from about 20% now to 25%. Now, where you get into the issue of access is when you look at the participation rates over time for those groups. And these are, the top line is the numbers that were in the earlier slide, going from 10.3 per 100 population to about 13.8 right now. Within that, the participation rates for Black students in this age group have gone from 6.7 to 9.1, but they're down some from their peak of 10.3 a few years ago. The way that the Bieber produces the data on Hispanic population, they haven't been doing it as long or as consistently as with the Black population, but in the data that they have, we actually see quite a dramatic increase in the rate of Hispanic student participation in the state university system from 2000 to 2006, and right now the participation rate is actually a little bit higher than for the average for the system. So it's a bit of a mixed message from this slide in terms of what the future might look like. And certainly the participation rate of black students is something that we need to pay very close attention to, and that goes in some ways to the concerns of the previous speaker. I did mention that there is also a correlation in graduate enrollment with economic trends in the state. It's not nearly as significant for the overall numbers in the system, but it is there, and it can spike in times of recession. If you look at the October unemployment rate over here, and that is the blue line down here, it's generally been going down, but with a spike up after the dot-com crash and September 11th. You can see that the rate of graduate student participation goes down when unemployment is going down and goes back up when unemployment rises. It's not a perfect correlation, but it is something to pay attention to. And overall, the level, it's a bit exaggerated, to be honest, on this graph. This is not a huge range over time from here to here, but it does illustrate some correlation. The regional population growth is also something that we need to be looking at in terms of the areas of the state that are currently projected to be growing the fastest. And you can see that the fastest growth right now, at least, is projected in the southwest part of the state, with the next highest growth rate over time in where we are now, the Central and Space Coast area, followed by the northeast area here. And the lower rates of population growth are in the north central and the northwest areas. Now here's the $64,000 question that we discussed earlier. Are these projections realistic? As I said, there were no significant revisions to the estimates last week. And a couple of the demographers commented that utility hookups are consistent with the projections. They're seeing, more meters turned on. That may be a little harder to interpret in Florida than in some other states where the number of houses and the number of people is maybe more closely related than it is here. But it made them unwilling to make major changes in either their prognostications. So.
How do you equate to people?
Well, that I don't know how they do that.
No, but I mean, what do they?
They have
a number?
Yeah, they have historically ratios of numbers of active meters to households to household size. So the assumption is that the household, and they do check the household size, or they try to, but it's difficult between a major census, the major censuses, to get details on the average household size or on how much time people are spending in their houses or things like that.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that all the utilities, even nationally, by looking at the recently filed reports, everybody is experiencing the trend in customer growth or hookups is pretty consistent in terms of whatever their territory is. Mm-hmm. But there are usage patterns that have changed dramatically in the last couple of years, and it has a lot to do, we think, with there's some price elasticity because of volatility of fuel and the nature of the housing market is changing and the improvements in efficiencies and so on. And I don't know if that influences the fact that more people live in condos and things of that nature, smaller square footage, if that would influence these connections or these ratios of hookups to people. So
but it is a national trend.
This is exactly the kind of information I'd like to learn more about, and I'm glad to have a panel of experts here to talk with.
I unfortunately just have a question, not an answer. But I guess where I was trying to go before, just on the wrong slide, but it's also looking at, we've invested hundreds of millions already in our state trying to change our economic base and add more legs to the stool, so to speak. And I guess I'm wondering what impact, if we looked at the total jobs we have in the state and what percentage of those don't require degrees or what level of educational attainment they require, if we are, and how we see that. I don't know how you project it, but it seems like that would have a fairly significant influence potentially on our demand as well. And does that get factored into anything that anyone's looking at this point?
It's a good question. The only thing that I have here that directly addresses that, and that I did hear some discussion about at the conference last week, is the unemployment rate is at a very low level and lower than nationally, which could either indicate that the state continues to remain, will continue to remain an attractive place for people to come get jobs, or it could mean that people are leaving and employers can't find people to fill positions. So it's difficult. It's a difficult one to interpret.
To your point, I think last year we saw some data, and it may have just been news stories, but that although we had a very low employment rate, that the type of job or the level of job was would not necessarily have been producing more college degree needs. I mean, you had a lot of low-paying jobs, a lot of service industry type jobs, as opposed to the ones where you would need the higher education, that sort of thing. So I don't know how that has an influence on all of this.
It is important to look at those data. The difficult part of it, whenever you do that, is trying to figure out where in the circle you are. Is the number of high-skilled jobs affected by the effectiveness and productivity of the university system, for example? You heard earlier from the University of Central Florida graduate who got his PhD and started hiring other graduates of the program here. Now, those are jobs that I'm assuming would not have been in the workforce projections 20 years ago. So, do we simply respond to what we estimate the demands of our current industry mix are, or do we plan, as the report recommended, do we engage in some strategic planning exercises with the business community and other leaders to try to figure out, what investments we can make to try to change that mix?
I think we all are committed to that.
Mm-hmm. So I won't dwell on this slide anymore. We all have, I think, the same questions. I will show this is a map of the changes in the enrollment growth projections from the Department of Education over the next 4 years. And you can see most counties, especially the large urban counties, have revised downward. The dark blue means significantly downward their enrollment projections, which is difficult to reconcile with keeping the current level of enrollment growth or of population growth that we have for the state. There are some exceptions to that. In Polk County, for example, St. Lucie County actually had upward revisions, as did some of the counties in the northern part of the state. So this may indicate a shifting of, not just a downward revision of population growth, but maybe a shift in the pattern of where that growth is happening.
It seems to me, and this is certainly, I don't have any data to support this, but from information that I read, if you look at the areas that have been revised up, and I know Polk County well, their housing costs are less than some of the counties that have been revised down. So people that seems that can commute to work move into counties that they can afford a home. So I don't know if that's the answer, but that is as good answers we have today.
Well, this is, again, is an area, Governor Roberts, where I quickly get out of my depth talking to you about it. That certainly sounds plausible to me.
I have nothing to support it except Council 100 report I read.
On the other hand, the next slide here, even with the downward revisions, there is still projected growth in many counties in the state. This is after revising downward in the 12th grade over the next 4 years. There's still significant growth in many areas of the state, just not as much as was previously projected. So I will leave with that 90,000-foot picture of the demographic situation and some of the questions that we're looking at right now. This certainly is an important issue to keep tabs on as we plan for future enrollment growth. And I encourage any questions you might have.
This is by way of a comment, Nate. I've listened to you do this a number of years. I have great confidence in what you do, and you do it beautifully. But I do think you have the same questions we do. And if Lynn or any of our board members can help us make it more accurate, we should all do it, because it makes a big difference in how we plan and what we do. Governor Pappas?
I think one of the challenges that we face is that the future of the population growth is, first of all, it's not an exact science by any means. So no matter what projections you use, you're basing it on a series of assumptions. Those assumptions can be right or wrong for a number of different reasons, not the least of which are very significant policy decisions that the state makes that have nothing to do with education. So we're going to be, like everyone else in the state, to some extent, victims, if you will, of other decision-making processes that will cause those population projections to go up or flatten out or potentially go down. So however obviously we need to do the best we can of assessing these numbers in our universe of reality. But I also think the other thing that challenges us is how do you deal with a system or make system-wide decisions about structure when you know that you are, in essence, giving your best guess at outcomes, and therefore there needs to be some elasticity in your decision-making, because no matter how good the numbers are, there's going to be variations in them over an extremely long period of time that we're trying to plan for. So I guess I'm just hoping that as we go through this exercise, one of the criteria we put into our model is that it has to be something that has the ability to respond to changes in our expectations, and we don't put all our eggs in one basket and then it turns out not to be the right one.
It's a very good point, because the one thing the university system is not known for is changing easily. And once we take a direction, as in a 12th university, and the demographics change, it's difficult to step back. So your point's well taken. Any other comments or questions? We have one more person who would like to make public comment. Nate, thank you very much. Job well done. Mark Kameth, I'm assuming that's doctor, is that correct? Associate Professor of English from Longwood, Florida. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Mark Kamrath. I teach early American literature here at the University of Central Florida. I've been here about 10 years, so I've seen a lot of growth, a lot of change in the area. I'm taking time out of my day-to-day, where I normally spend a good amount of effort preparing for a graduate level research class. I'm taking time out of this, my day-to-day, because I'd like to just voice a concern about the proposal, specifically related to the Pappas report, to restructure the state university system in a way that perhaps provides for a two-tiered educational structure where you have graduate research being concentrated in specific areas of the state and undergraduate education being concentrated in other places, as I understand it. I certainly acknowledge the need for priorities and clarity when it comes to institutional mission statements. I also acknowledge the need for quality control when it comes to growth in this state. At the same time, it seems to me that in a state like ours, which is changing and growing, that we also need to be aware of the relationship between metropolitan areas and graduate study programs. I would take, for example, the University of Pennsylvania, or actually the state of Pennsylvania and the state of Texas, which are comparable in terms of population growth and change. In those states, say, for example, the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Business is essential to what happens in that particular city of Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania. Likewise, in the state of Texas, Austin, the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center is essential to what happens at those institutions in terms of educating graduate students and even undergraduate students. My own education consists of attending University of Wisconsin-Madison in the early 1980s, and then attending University of Nebraska in the 1990s. For those of you who've been to that part of the country, you know that in Wisconsin, for example, Madison, Milwaukee, those are urban areas that are associated with quality research programs, whether they be medical schools or law schools or what have you. In Nebraska, Lincoln or Omaha, the University of Nebraska is central to what happens in that state, however sparsely populated it is. My concern, I guess, is that, again, given what knowledge I do have of the report, is that we pay careful attention to, as the previous speaker said here, to what is happening in the state in terms of regional population growth, whether it be in the southeast or the central part of Florida or elsewhere. And that if we are truly committed to looking at the larger picture and what benefits the state, that we consider carefully the ways that we apply particular findings in that report. In closing, I'd like to leave you with one image that has stuck with me these past 10 years, and it was a result of a conversation I had with a scholar at the University of Virginia. And it speaks to, I think, the need for the state to have and its governors to have not only an understanding of what's happening in terms of graduate education, and let's say, for example, digital technology and the need to produce students who have the ability to think critically, read carefully, write clearly, and to do so in a digital medium. What I ask is that we just consider carefully the implications of some of the recommendations and what the outcome of some of those proposed solutions may be. And the image I want to leave you with, I guess, is this, with that conversation I had. An individual told me that if one were to stand at an off-ramp, this is several years back, but if you were to stand at an off-ramp outside of Washington, D.C., which is a metropolitan area, but if you were to stand there at an off-ramp with a sign in the one hand that said PhD, and on the other hand a sign that said XML, referring to computer coding, that you would be run over by the demand for that kind of expertise, the expertise that demands an understanding of computer technologies and also more traditional skills concerning reading, writing, and thinking. So on that note, I thank you for listening to me. And
you made some very valid points. Are there any questions or comments? Thank you for taking your time. That's exactly what we're here for, and we appreciate you coming to our meeting. Is there anyone else that wants to speak? We're required, aren't we, Nancy, to sit here till 3 o'clock because we advertised that we would. So with that, I'm going to invite anybody to walk around. Those of us that will sit right here in case anybody comes in. And if they don't, you can consider it at 3 o'clock it's adjourned. Thank you very much. If you hear the gavel come, we'll be taking public. Thank you very much for attending today. I'll sit right here. So would you, Ms. Francis?
Yes, ma'am.